we don't see such indications.
Let's bring in California Democrat Congressman John Garamendi. The congressman sits on the Armed Services Committee. Good to see you, Congressman. Let's get right to it here.
Sure.
As the investigation is now focusing on terrorism, how likely is it that a more direct link to a terror organization could surface?
Well, I think part of what the director said is really relevant here, and that is very early in the investigation. They don't see it at this time, but it's still out there. It's still a possibility. We'll find out. We'll find out within a few days, probably, if there's more to this. My personal view of it is this is far too complex to be just two people. But, you know, that's somebody that's standing 2,300 miles away from the situation right now.
Yeah. It is certainly still early in this particular investigation, but the shootings have raised questions about the readiness of federal and local law enforcement agencies to identify potential homegrown terrorists. Are enough resources being put into play to deal with the homegrown potential?
No. It's very, very obvious that there are not sufficient resources. The FBI is going to need to beef up its internal operations. They're going to have more personnel, perhaps more equipment, and maybe even more authority. All of that needs to be reviewed by Congress. We're in the midst of an appropriation process right now. I would hope that my colleagues that are on the Appropriations Committee are looking at the FBI budget and quite possibly enhancing it. Also, the other intelligence organizations. This is very, very important, and we have to reach outside the country. So that means what are our relationships with other countries and their investigative organizations? Are we as tight, as close as necessary, trading information back and forth? I think we saw from the Paris event that the answer is no, we are not. We must beef that up, and that takes us to the visa issue. People that hold a valid passport from the European Union countries can enter the United States without a visa. We need to look at that. In fact, there's a bill that has been introduced, a bipartisan bill in the House that goes to that question and will make it much more difficult for people that have not been thoroughly checked out by their home country and that home country sending their relevant information back and forth to us in the United States. They will not be able to come into the United States if this bill becomes law.
Sounds like just another thing you have to add to the list of things that need to be looked at, sir.
A long list.
Long list. The attorneys for the Farouk families, you know, they voiced concern that there is a rush to judgment, that Muslims in this country may be now unfairly treated. Are you hearing from any of your Muslim constituents? Are they concerned about backlash?
Of course. Of course they are, and rightly so. There's going to be a backlash, and I think for all of us in the United States, we need to be aware that we should not paint an entire part of our country's population with a broad brush that would indict them, even though they are upstanding and outstanding citizens of our community. So we must be aware of that, but this is not a new phenomenon. We've seen this in my own community. We have a large Sikh population in our community. They have been targeted. They have been shot down on the street because they wear a turban. This is the kind of thing that we need to be very aware of, that America is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious society.
Let's talk specifically about gun control here, sir, because as you well know, California has some of the toughest gun laws in the country. However, these suspects were able to still obtain these weapons legally. 2 of the guns used in the assault were purchased in 2011, the other 2 in 2012. Is there a specific law that could have prevented this if it could pass, and what would that law be?
Well, I suspect there is no specific law, but we do know that by passing these gun safety laws, as in California, you significantly reduce the probability, and you significantly reduce the availability of guns to those who are criminals, who are crazy, mentally ill, or who are somehow acting inappropriately within their community. For example, domestic violence. We do need, at the federal level, to close what is a huge loophole, and that is if you're on the terrorist watch list and you cannot fly, you can still buy a gun. That makes no sense at all, and we really ought to close that. Unfortunately, the Republicans in the Senate 2 nights ago decided that that was not an appropriate policy for America, that somehow we ought to allow those who cannot fly to be able to purchase guns. I think the American public says, huh? What's that all about?
Well, and in his weekly address today, the president was taking a bit of a tougher rhetorical stance in this fight. I mean, critics are suggesting for the sake of reassuring the country, he needs to strike a more aggressive tone. What's your take on that? Do you want to hear more from the president?
Well, certainly the president is our national leader. Certainly he needs to be out in front of all of these issues. He's certainly been out there in front on gun safety issues, and that's good. He is calling for specific legislation, and that's good. But there's also the issue of international leadership, and I think by and large he has set the appropriate strategy in place for dealing with ISIS. That is, many countries involved, particularly the surrounding countries, Turkey, Jordan, the Gulf states, all of those involved in the fight against ISIS. There's always going to be a discussion about the tactics that implement the strategy, but I think most of us agree that the strategy is correct. We're definitely going to continue with the air war. We're definitely going to continue with special forces, and I think the president is quite correct. We should not put major elements of our Army, battalions, heavy armor, and artillery and the like, that boots on the ground, that is the vast number of boots, have to come from the neighboring countries. Otherwise, once again, it's America in the Middle East conducting what by many in that area would consider to be some sort of a invasion.
And what you may be in part referring to there is the president's earlier decision to send a small contingent of special operations forces to Syria. So do you support any sort of military buildup in the region, and can it be effective at all?
Well, it can be effective, but first of all, we need to be very clear about what we're doing. We have to have an authorization to use force, otherwise known as a declaration of war. We do not have that, and it's a very tenuous legal situation that the president and the military are involved in Syria. It actually reaches all the way back to the initial authorization to use force against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And then that's now been stretched, I don't know, 1,000, 1,200 miles to the west into Syria. So we really need in Congress to come to grips with this reality that we are at war in Syria as well as in Iraq against ISIS. And that requires us in Congress to take the responsibility that's given to us, in fact, thrust upon us by the Constitution, which says only Congress can declare war.
Do you believe that increasing the military there in Syria helps increase our security domestically here?
Not with major boots on the ground. We definitely have to be involved. We definitely have to have a leadership role. There's no doubt about that. We obviously have a very significant air power and aerial bombardment going on. We do have advisors on the ground in Iraq training and preparing the Iraqi forces, which is absolutely essential. Iraq has to protect itself against ISIS, and that requires those training elements. With regard to Syria, we do have special forces that are involved in Syria now, and I think that that's appropriate. But I think it would be a major mistake to put major elements of our Army or even the Marines in those areas with heavy armament brigades and the like. That is American boots on the ground, and then it becomes an American war. This can only be won by a regional effort to root out these terrorists, ISIS. And if we try to do it on our own, it will not solve the underlying problem. I think there's a need for a new strategy here. We ought to think about a strategic triad. One, defense, military. That's certainly in play now. We ought to think about development and diplomacy as the other two parts of this. Economic development in that area, when you have more than, I don't know, 50, 60% of the young men in those countries with no hope, no job, no future, you know you're going to have problems. So economic development becomes essential, not just in the Middle East, but really in many other parts of the world. And of course, our diplomacy, bringing together the countries in the area to fight a common enemy, which is a great threat to those countries, whether it's Jordan, Turkey, or Iraq.
California Congressman John Garamendi, is always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alex.
The university that is urging students to arm themselves in the wake of the San Bernardino shootings. Yep.